Thank you so much, and let's get started since we're on a pretty tight timeline here. And ladies and gentlemen, if you aren't sufficiently depressed yet by all the discussions that have been taking place, either you weren't attending or you are an optimist by nature, let's see if what kind of mood we can put forth with this particular discussion. This one is about the EU, ladies and gentlemen, and without further ado, it is my great pleasure of announcing this spectacular panel. To my left, the gentleman you have already seen during yesterday's opening. He, of course, is the president of the Institute for European Studies, a well-known figure in European affairs, a former EU Commissioner for Trade, and of course a former Belgian Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister. Karel de Gucht is with us. To his left, I'm very delighted to welcome an associate professor in the Division of International Studies here at the Catholic University of Korea. Joon Kim is with us. To his left, a gentleman who I'm sure is familiar and known to many of you here in the audience. He is the ambassador of the EU delegation to Korea, a very seasoned diplomat. He's held posts in Switzerland and Brussels before. Michael Reiterer is with us, Ambassador Reiterer, and to the very far left, very glad to welcome an esteemed colleague, award-winning journalist. He's the chief political commentator and associate editor at the Financial Times, where he also happens to be a member of the editorial board. Philip Stevens, wonderful, eclectic panel that we have assembled. And without further ado, Mr. de Gucht, I would yield the floor to you. I'd say about 4 to 5 minutes max. Just give us a couple of pointers and we'll dive right into the discussion.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to dwell on the reasons of this rising populism in the European Union. I mentioned yesterday the very close link, I believe, with migration. And just to give you an example, I don't think I could mention it yesterday. At a certain moment in time, there has been a vote in the Council of Ministers on the distribution of 160,000 political asylum seekers, by the way, protected by the Geneva Conventions over the 28 member states. And it was voted, I mean, in the Council of Ministers, because since the Lisbon Treaty, this kind of decisions can be taken by a majority. Now, nevertheless, it never got implemented. So even if you are voting in the European Union, it means that there are still limits to what you can do with the result of such a vote. I think that's very telling, and it says something about the extreme difficulties that we are facing with respect to migration. Now, I would like to make the following point. Whenever the European Union is in a difficult situation, we manage to find solutions. And you could even say that to a certain extent it's only when the European Union is with its back against the wall that they really take decisive steps. Now, that can be, it's maybe not the ideal situation, but that's a fact of life. And when you look at the history of the European Union over the last 70 years, we have had very long and very difficult episodes. So especially young people are thinking that it's the first time ever that we got such a difficult situation in the European Union. That is blatantly not the case, you know. In the beginning of the European Union, the whole decision-taking process has been blocked, I think, for about 15 years or something like that, as a result of the so-called agreement of Luxembourg not to vote unless everybody agreed on beforehand. Then we got stuck for another decade before, in the beginning of the 80s, we went to the decision on the internal market and some changes on the decision-taking procedures. Well, another decade that nothing happened. So there have been several episodes where it was worse than now because we simply didn't decide anymore. And that's not the case. And the reason we are now taking decisions is largely Because as a result of the Amsterdam, Nice, and especially the Lisbon Treaty, we are now taking decisions by majority voting for about 90% of what we are presently doing and putting into practice. So that's my first remark. The second one is, and that's maybe somewhat, you tell me when I have to stop, huh?
Absolutely.
I have to stop? No, not yet.
I'll give you one more point.
Oh, 1 point, that's good. Not a minute, but a point.
That's right.
That's the difference. No, it's
30 seconds per point, by the way.
No. But you're stealing my time, huh? You cannot do that. Huh? I would like to make a point on democracy, you know. When you look at how the European Union has been established, it has been established by diplomats and by politicians behind closed doors. That's how it was done. Completely behind closed doors. I have been in the European Parliament from 80 to 94. I have seen that transition to democracy, and democracy means that you have to take decisions that are known, and it is known who was in favor and who was against. That's very essential in democracy. And that's one of the reasons that we have been facing so many difficulties. On the other hand, I think we should be pleased and lucky that we now are a democratic institution. But one of the main reasons that we got into very difficult discussion on a number of issues, migration, but also, for example, enlargement, is precisely that, you know, that it was not any longer the diplomats that could decide behind closed doors.
Thank you so much for kicking off this panel with your preliminary remarks. Of course, much more to come, but first I want to yield the floor to Professor Joon-Soo Kim with, if you will, a Korean perspective on EU affairs. Very much looking forward to it.
Okay, 15 or 16 years ago, I had to choose a topic on my PhD dissertation at the University of Chicago. And my advisor asked me why a student from Korea planned to write something on Europe or European politics. I told her, Korea need to learn a lot more from more advanced and more civilized nations, or civilized countries. And I don't think the United States is not among them. She laughed, and I don't think she was offended by my words, because she was a kind of German-American who moved to the United States back in 1930s. But how time changed. 15 or 16 years ago, I never imagined I would be at a conference like this titled The Rise of Populism and the Rise of Illiberal International Order in Europe. So Europe is in multiple crises. Brexit crisis, populism crisis, and refugee crisis, and Eurozone crisis. And my hunch is that at the root of all these crises and all these difficulties was a decision made by French and Italian politicians to create a more coherent and more tight European Union back in 1989. The French and Italian politicians decided to impose exact prices from Germany for unification. And Germany agreed to pay the price for their unification. And French and Italian politicians also wanted to prevent Germany from acquiring hegemonic power status. And Germany agreed to put on golden handcuffs. Okay. But it was a sheer realpolitik. And as currency integration was politically motivated, as it was prompted by political necessity, it was deeply flawed. It was deeply defective at the beginning. I won't repeat all the drawbacks and weaknesses inherent in common currency. But one of the most serious problems is that there is a huge gap between creditor countries and debtor countries. Creditor countries playing the role of policy makers, and debtor countries taking the role of policy takers. And nobody knows how to bridge the gap between these two groups of European countries. Currency integration could have reaped its expected results if the European Union is composed of a few like-minded states, a few like-minded countries. But with Eurozone composed of 19 states or 19 countries of highly unequal economic power, it would never make it. And a solution might be found if Germany is more willing to play the leadership role more actively than now. But Germany has proved to be a very reluctant hegemon. And German politicians are fond of saying, whoever asks us for leadership, what they mean is our money. Okay? So that's the beginning, and that's the root of all the problems the EU is facing now. That's my point.
Thank you, Professor. And indeed, the role of Germany probably will be discussed. I'm based in Berlin, Germany myself, so the leadership question, the leadership concept that is being assigned to Germany is indeed a crucial one for the years ahead. And as you pointed out, the EU seems to be in a somewhat constant crisis mode. And Ambassador Reiterer, how does it feel to be the ambassador of a continent that is in eternal crisis mode and has been for some time?
Well, at the risk of being detached from what's going on in Europe, I don't have the feeling that I'm representing somebody who is in crisis, who is just about to commit suicide or anything like that. I think I'm representing the biggest trading bloc on the world. I'm representing a bloc where a big part of it is using the euro, which is the second largest currency in the world, catching up with the dollar. The dollar has a share of 39%. The euro has 36% share already. We have economic growth right now, which is larger than in the United States or in Japan. The European Union is the largest investor worldwide, is the largest investor in Korea, for example. It's the third largest trading partner for Korea. Therefore, I was slightly surprised when I read about a trade strategy here in Korea which failed to manage the European Union at all, because I called it's a low-hanging fruit to increase. The European Union is engaged in free trade negotiations worldwide. We have an agreement with Korea, which is in the 7th year of application. It's successful. We have increased the trade between the two countries, or the two partners, by 38% over the last 6 years. We have potential to further increase it. So I fail to see the crisis mood in international relations. And as we should talk about populism, well, I think the EU is doing something which is completely against the trend. When I was listening now about all America First and all these issues, I mean, there we are on a completely different page. And I would say we are on a completely page from the outset. Because even if you look at the Treaty of the European Union, you can read what is the purpose of the European Union in international relations? To promote an international system based on stronger multilateral cooperation and good global governance. That's the program. And when you see what is the incarnation of the program, then unfortunately we made a mistake. Because in 2016, we published the EU Global Strategy. And what's the mistake of it? Well, it is a little bit longer than a tweet. But if you bother to read it, it's exactly the contrary of the tweet of President Trump, which was just discussed beforehand. The whole program is about multilateralism, is about the rule of law. It might be out of touch, you might think, when you hear all the return of geopolitics and geoeconomics, but I would say no, because that's also what I hear here in the tensions on the Korean Peninsula. What are the expectations on the European Union? Well, try us to keep lines of communication open. Insist on the rule of law. Give us your experience, which you had in brokering the deal with Iran. So there's a demand for these soft powers, if you wish. And even if you read this global strategy I referred to, you would even find the sentence, well, we are perfectly aware that soft power alone is not enough. So therefore, what we have done in the European Union in the last 2 years was a stronger focus on defense. So in a nutshell, I think we are non-populist in international relations because we stand by all these principles which the liberal order stands for, and we are trying to make a contribution that we don't have the illiberal order.
A very passionate plea, as one would expect from the ambassador of the EU delegation here. On behalf of the EU, nevertheless, there are problems, of course, which we will dive into, but not before we hear Philip Stevens, of course, from the Financial Times. Steve, how sick are you by now of talking about Brexit?
Pretty sick. So I'm not really going to discuss Brexit, although I'm very happy to answer questions. I mean, I'm not a sort of pessimist about Europe, and I still regard myself as a European, even though my own country is leaving the European Union. But I think it's fair to say that there have been three successive shocks have hit Europe. First, the Eurozone crisis, which came out of the global financial crash. Second, the migration crisis, largely but not entirely driven by the civil wars in the Middle East. And thirdly, this upsurge of populism in countries across the Union. And it's Poland and Hungary, but it's also the National Front in France, it's the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, it's Five Star in Italy, and of course it's Brexit in the UK. And for me, of those three shocks, the rise of nationalism is the most dangerous, the only existential threat to the EU. Now, there are different national characteristics, different individual causes, but there are, I think, one or two common underpinnings. And if you'll allow me, I just want to read a description of the impact of globalization offered by two eminent Europeans. And they say that globalization involves a constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of the social condition, everlasting uncertainty and agitation. All that is fixed and fast frozen are swept away. All that is solid melts into the air. The cosmopolitan character of production and consumption in each country has drawn from under the feet of industry the national ground on which it once stood. Now, when Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote those words, they were talking about the first phase of globalization at the end of the second half of the 19th century. And they were wrong about its impact. The Communist Manifesto predicts that the impact of that first wave of globalization would be the breaking down of national barriers and frontiers. And of course, what we saw instead in the second half of the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th century was the rise of nationalisms and the national competition, which eventually ended in the First World War. And we're seeing that again. I would argue. We're seeing a fragmentation and a turning back away from the sort of, if you like, the postmodern integration that Europe has done so well in the second half of the 20th century. And I think if one wants to defeat populism, the starting point has to be that populists have a point. Their prescriptions are snake oil. They're not offering solutions, but what they have done is identified genuine grievances. And just as in the second half of the 19th century, globalization had a destabilizing impact on the security and well-being of ordinary people, that's what's happened again in the opening decades of the 21st century. If you know, globalization in my own country has been good for the top 1%, maybe the top 5%. But most people have seen their salaries, their income stagnate. They've seen a huge increase in the insecurity of their employment. The blue-collar jobs, which lasted a lifetime in, say, car manufacturing plants or in the white-collar jobs in offices, are no longer there. Short-term insecurity is very strong. And incomes are driven down by migration at the bottom end, and there is a cultural dislocation from migration. Now, for me, all these are problems that national policy can address. The problem is that national policies, particularly in my own country, haven't addressed those shocks. And until they do, we are going to get the snake oil vendors with eager customers. I see the moderator nodding, which says I should wind up. I mentioned in a question yesterday that some of the policy prescriptions I would advocate, and they're national and European, include changes in our tax systems, which have become much more regressive, which have allowed concentration of power in a relatively small number of companies. I would say we need stronger education and training policies, stronger competition policies, and we need to understand that globalization and the liberal order that we're talking about at this conference will only survive. And this is something we understood after the Second World War. You have to have consent. And consent depends on this system having a broad base of advantage and benefit for a large number of people. One final point which I meant to make at the beginning, I wanted to thank Aslan for inviting me to this wonderful summit. I've been here a number of times, and I always go home feeling somewhat wiser and more educated. So thank you.
And hopefully wiser and more educated you will feel as well after we are done. Karel, Philip Stevens is saying the populists, while he, I would assume, doesn't agree with the means and their rhetoric, but yet they have a point. Their grievances are justified, Philip Stevens says. Would you agree?
I would like to make 2 points, because I have been listening with attention to Mr. Stevens, and he mentioned Marx and Engels, and that you saw the rising of nationalism ultimately, eventually, in fact, resulting in the First and afterwards the Second World War, and that's the reasoning. Now, there is a big difference, you know, because then you had nationalism in national states, of course, but that were not bound by treaty links, and now they are. Now they are together in the European Union, the 28 of them, at least provisionally, and that makes it, I believe, much less dangerous than it was in the past. Yes, you have rising populism, rising nationalism, but you have the overarching European Union that is keeping it in control. For example, imagine that you would have Hungary as an independent state now. Well, then I don't know where it would end, you know. Probably the same with Italy, by the way, yeah? Because we limit it to Hungary and Poland. Poland is, by the way, a somewhat different case, I believe, but Italy, for example, now they are being kept in control, and to a certain extent, we are even helped by Brexit, because one of the lessons that we get from Brexit is that it is extremely, extremely difficult to get out of the European Union, even for a big economy. So what would it be for a small economy like Hungary, where you have 6% of the national budget financed by the European budget? That's my first remark. Do the populists have a point? It is true that the benefits of globalization, of certain globalizations, are not evenly distributed. That's a fact of life. But we should be clear what we mean by globalization. For example, the successive enlargements of the European Union, they are good examples of globalization. This is globalization. And what you see is that it's always the ones that were already in that benefited more than the ones that were coming in, and the image, nevertheless, in the general public is exactly the opposite. The internal market that we realized in the 80s, it's a very good example of globalization. This globalization within the regional context of the European Union, but European Union being the biggest economic force in the world. So there are good examples of globalization as well, but then you need globalization that has a direction that to some extent is steered, And the globalization at, let's say, the level of the world, the global level, as we normally see it, it's much less the case. First example, first remark. Second remark, it would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to stop globalization. Because if we were to do that, we would end up in a gigantic economic crisis. So we have to fix it and not destroy it. And how can we fix it? My personal opinion is that we have something to do about the global tax system, especially we have to start in the European Union, of course, with that. And major steps are being put, for example, in the OECD, that is coming forward with a number of possibilities. And why is that? Well, it is because our continental and also in Great Britain, tax systems are still largely based on human efforts, on the work of human beings, be it as blue-collar workers or whatever. And that's not any longer the case. Wealth and added value is less than in the past created by human effort. So we need other vectors of producing wealth and added value, and we have to tax them. And that's, of course, not an easy decision to take, but we will have to take it. We have to change fundamentally our tax system.
And indeed, because at the end of the day, I think the point that Philip Stevens has made, that so many, even within the European Union, are increasingly feeling left out and feeling left behind, is, of course, a dangerous trend in many of the countries. Professor Joon Kim, you expressed that your interest in the EU arose first from what you perceive to be the high level of civility and order within the EU. Do you still see that high level of civility and order?
Yes. The EU and the project of European integration are a valuable asset humankind achieved in the last half of the 20th century. That's true. It succeeded in creating international peace zone, a kind of normal community, and also a zone of economic prosperity. The EU also acts as a guarantor for civil and human rights, democratically accountable governments, and the rule of law. But I think these are already sufficiently significant, sufficiently substantial achievements. Other countries in other parts of the world envy and try to imitate. My question is, what is the point? What is the point of achieving ever closer union? What is the point of integrating more, especially at a time more integration generates cultural, economic, and political backlashes? I believe the EU needs a kind of moderation, a kind of downsizing. EU needs to give up obsession with ever closer Union, obsession with more integration in order to save or in order to rescue the project of European integration.
Interesting. So basically you are arguing against President Macron's plans of a more closer union. You are arguing that is exactly what is hurting, what is damaging the peace within the EU. And when you say downsizing, I just want to be correct. We're 28 member states, soon to be 27. You're suggesting we kick out more? We kick out more nations to become less? Or
I don't have a concrete idea of what kind of downsizing I mean, but if downsizing is needed, the EU face it directly,
but
without fear. Yeah.
You're envisioning a more looser union rather than a more stricter one. Obviously, a point that is being made in Europe. Ambassador, something tells me that you're not agreeing with that assertion of a looser union.
He's not alone, you know.
No, I think we are also, the facts are different. I think last week, decision was taken to grant candidate status to Albania and the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. So they made one additional step to come to the European Union. So even if the UK is leaving, I think very soon there will be a 30 there. Well, is that good? I think it is good if you look at geopolitics. I mean, see what the European Union has done since 1989. And that's also the reason why the European Union, by the way, got the Peace Nobel Prize in 2012, stabilizing a huge area which came out of the Soviet Empire. And I think that was a contribution to peace in the world, because if we have a major problem in Europe, and we had a problem when Yugoslavia was breaking off, that would be a destabilizing factor in world politics, and that's the least thing which we need right now. There are enough problems already. But with populism, yes, populism is on the rise. And one has to do something with that, which is not easy, of course, because as it was said, populists are very good in putting the finger where the problem is, but they're extremely bad in coming up with a solution. So whenever you have populists as part of the government, it's normally a failure because they don't have this easy solution. But what they give, and I think this is the dangerous aspect, they give the impression that there are solutions. Very simplistic solutions. Normally, these solutions are not solutions, but it gives the impression. And I think the mistake which was done, and which is often done, that we argue a little bit in an elitist manner about facts, statistics, and nobody is interested in that. People vote very often with their guts feeling. So one has to, without falling in the trap of being a counter-populist, because that wouldn't help, one has to argue also on the emotional side. I always call that we need to build up an emotional intelligence, that we can talk to the people in a manner that they understand. And actually, one shouldn't do what I have just done and say, let's talk to the people. But who the hell are the people? We are the people, and I think this is something which we must internalize in a much better way. The best example I can come up with was an example which was made in 1992 by Lord Cockfield at the time, who came up with the idea, the costs of non-Europe. So if we manage to show each and every European citizen how he or she would be worse off if the European Union didn't exist, what would fall apart, what would disappear, I think we would have a big society of fans.
Ambassador, you said that, yes, the UK may be leaving soon. Other countries have the status of being candidates, and that's a good thing from your point of view, Philip Stevens. Would you agree? I mean, we clearly have two differing sides here. One is calling for a looser union, the other is saying the more the better. What side do you fall on?
Look, I think the enlargement of the European Union was a good thing. You have to take the analogy, the Cofield analogy further, you have to imagine what Eastern and Central Europe would have been like had the EU not enlarged, and I think it would have been in a lot worse shape. And I think enlargement eventually to the Western Balkans is absolutely essential for the stability of that part of Europe. And as I said, I lament greatly the fact that Britain is leaving. But where I do agree with one or two of my colleagues on the panel is the idea that changing the rhetoric or changing the language is going to solve things. I think you have to change the facts. Let me just give you one or two for the UK. In the last 20 years, the pay of the top, if you like, the top businessmen, the directors of the top 100 companies in Britain, rose by 400%. It quadrupled. The pay of average workers during the same period rose by 10%. This is in real terms. Now, that to me says quite rightly, and the pay of the people right at the bottom actually was stagnant and falling. That to me says this is an unfair system. And I perfectly understand, while it wasn't logical, why people in the more depressed areas of Britain decided to grab any opportunity. See, I don't think that the British voted against Brussels or the EU. I think they voted against a system which was manifestly helping those cosmopolitan people like me, but also bankers who lived in the main centres of economic activity in the UK and was leaving behind a vast section. So I think, you know, we will, look, Britain isn't heading, Europe isn't heading, marching to war as it did at the end of the 19th century. But when I first came to Asia, started coming to Asia regularly 15, 20 years ago, I used to sort of be rather, I suppose, slightly arrogant and say to my Asian friends, look, why are you still talking about the Second World War? Why you Koreans and you Japanese still fighting about this? We Europeans, we got over all that. You know, we left it behind. We're now living in an age where Polish politicians stand up and start demanding war reparations from Germany, where stupid British politicians stand up and say, well, we're better than you lot because we won the war. So these, if you like, the currents of nationalism have come back. I actually happen to think the EU has done a very good job in stabilizing and is, you know, that Europe owes its peace and prosperity largely to the EU, also to NATO and the American security guarantee. But I think that whether it's looser or tighter is not the question. It's how do governments, as part of the EU, address these very real problems. And as long as politicians just say, let's change the language, that's, you know, that for me is defeatist.
But are those fundamentally European problems? I mean, as you said correctly, the widening gap between rich and poor is very evident if you just look at the statistics and numbers. But you have the same phenomenon in the United States.
And we've got Donald Trump in the United States.
There you go. So at the end of the day, is this really a European phenomenon? Is this a European problem?
No, sorry, that's exactly what I wanted to say. The example is certainly right. But this is a failure of the British political system, the American political system, or whatever. Just imagine for 1 second there would be a decision by somebody in the EU regulating that the boss, the CEO, should only earn 5 times the basic salary of any worker. There would be a revolution. These guys in Brussels, now they are completely crazy. Now they get involved into things where they shouldn't be involved. So yes, there's a problem, but that problem should be fixed nationally in the UK should be fixed nationally in the United States, because the EU can't do it.
And nationally in France, where a third of the population voted for the National Front, and nationally in Germany, which for the first time has a far-right party.
Yeah,
so these are not, you know, these are Anglo-Saxon problems, but they're not just Anglo. In Italy, where the Five-Star Movement, you know, has, you know, if you like, is the leading party. So, you know, we mustn't just say these are not simply Anglo-Saxon problems. These are problems that all European, in Hungary, in Poland, these are countries that all European, and I say this as a European, not as someone who defends my own government, because I think my own government's made an appalling mistake.
Well, it's not alone in that, but Karel de Gucht, I know you've been eager to jump in here.
Well, I would just like to say something on this pay of the very high salaries of CEOs and CFOs of big companies, quoted companies, you know. This is not a European problem, it's not an Anglo-Saxon problem, it's a global problem. Where does it come from? Well, as a result of the globalization, you have seen flourishing very big companies, you know, very, very big companies. You see takeovers of tens of billions and even sometimes more than 100 billion euros or dollars. You know. And the shareholders are making enormous profits, enormous, I mean, really enormous, as a result of, well, well-guided decisions, but also because they are lucky, yeah, from time to time. Because I've been in the political world, in the academic world, but also in business. I know a little bit of these three worlds. And so the reasoning of these CEOs, I'm not a CEO, by the way. I'm not somebody who is getting that high salary, but they are reasoning, look, they are making such huge profits, we should at least have something of it now, a percentage of it. Huh? We are entitled to that because we are the ones, the management that is really managing the company, and to a certain extent that's also true. Now, that is of course creating a terrible gap with 99% of the population. And I believe that the only way to curb that, you know, is at the international level, because this is a global competition for talents. So we have to take a global decision on that we limit this. And I believe that over time we will need to tax capital at the global level. I mean, we need to do that because capital has become so much more important than in the past in creating added value. So we have to do something about it. But isolating the pay of CEOs is not the right way to do it. That's my personal opinion on that.
Could we? But it's also perception. I mean, for those who know a little bit soccer, who is complaining that Messi and Ronaldo are earning incredible amount of money? This has nothing to do with any worker, but all these workers, they are there in the stadium and they cheer him up.
Yeah, Ambassador, but that's different. That's Panem et Circenses, you know, that's not the same.
Yeah, but
that's not the same, I mean, that's Roman. Huh?
But by the way, Ambassador, you're from Europe. Let's call it football, not soccer. That's an American analogy and term that I will not allow on this panel. So, ladies and gentlemen, I know we have a great deal of expertise here in the audience and interest as well. I think we have a microphone. And let's get some input and questions, get this discussion rolling. Of course, many more questions that I have as well, but let's get some in here from the audience first. Please, introduce yourself quickly.
Stefano, Seoul Village. I think part of the reason why populism is rising in Europe is the fact that there's a widening gap between...
Can you stand up, please?
Yeah, there's a widening gap between the hunger for more Europe and the love Europeans feel for the European ideals on one hand, and the lack of courage from Europe on the other side to define itself. You're talking enlargement of Europe, but what is Europe beyond a set of a nebula of agreements? And there was an attempt to build a constitution to define Europe. It failed, and I get it. I understand, okay, it raises, is it federal, is it this, is it that, is it a Christian or this? I understand the tricky part of it, but it's time to, okay, we respect a lot the founding fathers of Europe. It's time to talk about with the people, and if not a constitution, a set of principles, universal, not a negative way of defining Europe, but we are not where we will meet by not being in Europe, but a positive set of principles, easily communicating to the whole people. That's all.
All right, thank you. If you pass on the microphone to the lady on your right, we can collect a couple. Please go ahead.
Okay, hello. This is Arum New from Seoul National University Asia Center. So my question is about yesterday there is a populism and the USA the session. Now what I found is this is isn't it kind of the rise of the anti-elitism rather than like just populism in general. What is the difference? Is the kind of the context of the anti-elitism related to the populism? USA and the EU. I know there's a lot of the factor like the rise of the populism, like the refugee matter and the widening economic gap. But what about the anti-elitism, like for all of us, like in the Asan Plenum?
Thank you. Are there any more questions or inputs to get in the first round? That doesn't seem to be the case. So, Philip Stevens, you already alluded to the elitism that people are revolting against or are feeling strong feelings against. Perhaps you want to take that one.
I think the sense of economic and sometimes cultural grievance and anti-elitism are two sides of the same coin, as it were. The populists are very clever in one, attributing problems such as, you know, and I wasn't saying the answer to all this lies in cutting the pay of CEOs, that's silly, but what I was trying to do was illustrate that these huge disparities in income are a serious cause of a problem. But what the populists do, I think quite cleverly, is to say, look, here are the genuine problems. Your pay is stagnating. The pay of the bankers is going through the roof. Your communities are being disrupted by huge influxes of migrants, and the people living, you know, in London, well, they just have these people to work for them as maids and servants and whatever, and they benefit from it. And from those real grievances, they can then say, and you know, those are the people, and point to the established parties. Those are the people who are responsible. So you can attack the elites. So if you look at the Brexit vote, it was a sort of cry of anger and rage, I think, in many respects. And it was rage against both the conditions that people found themselves in, and also their belief and their perception that those conditions were things that the elites had completely escaped. So if you look at the geographical distribution of the votes, most of the big cities which are prosperous, so London, Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, Leeds, voted to remain in the EU. Once you got to smaller provincial towns and to the countryside, those people voted against what they saw as the elites in the big cities who were doing well. So I don't think they're sort of separate things. As opposed to the setting out the principles of the EU, I mean, I think it's far too early for a European demos, although I wouldn't rule that out. But actually, if you look at the Lisbon Treaty, Articles 2 and 3 seem to me to have a rather good description of the sort of values and principles for which Europeans stand. It seems to me, though, the genius of the EU is in allowing national governments to align their narrow national interests with a bigger, broader mutual interest. So turning international relations into the positive-sum game, which the populists or Trump or whatever want now to reverse and turn it back into a zero-sum game.
I think there seems to be some consensus on this panel, and please tell me if I'm wrong, that the EU needs fixing. Is that an understanding? Is that an understanding that I'm getting from this panel, that the EU, in its current shape or form, can no longer meet the challenges, both domestic and international? So, sometimes it takes an outside look. Professor Joon Kim, you are being given the high task of fixing the EU. A very small task, as you can imagine. You've already alluded to the fact that a looser union would be more desirable. What else? What else would you put forth in order to make this union called the EU stronger?
I think many points to strengthening democratic legitimacy of the EU, making it democratically more accountable to the people.
How?
But I don't think more democracy would be the solution to the crisis the EU is faced with. People want to be masters in their own houses.
They want to be?
People want to be masters in their own houses. Not the democratic control of the EU with its 28 or 27 member states, with a population of over 500 million and 24 different languages. So, for the foreseeable future, I believe the EU or integrated Europe would never be people's house. One would have much difficulty building institutional arrangement, enabling people to have a kind of sense of being in control over the EU. Even if such an arrangement could be found, it would not work effectively. So, in fact, I don't have any concrete solution to that problem. So let me repeat what I said before. EU need to be less assertive and less, what is that? Less assertive. And if need be, the EU should be even ready to renounce some of the important achievements of the last few decades.
Mike?
Karel de Gucht, the EU, I think nobody who understands history would contest the idea that the EU was not just a good but a vital idea post-45. Could it be that in the year 2018, the EU has somewhat lost its purpose?
First of all, I completely disagree that we have to get to a looser union. Not because I want to integrate everything, but I have never heard a serious discourse from somebody how you would get to a looser union. I never got an answer to that question, you know. Maybe somebody in this panel has the answer, but I don't have it. And let me give you a very striking example, and that's Britain. By the way, I like Britain. Huh? I like Britain, Mrs. Stevens, very much, and we will miss you, because we won't have people anymore with red socks, you know. We won't have that anymore. And it's also a very false judgment to say that many of the problems we are facing in Europe is a result of the position of Great Britain. That is simply not true. Of course, they were not always easy, but whenever we got to an agreement, they always put it into practice, they implemented it, and that cannot be said of a number of countries that are so-called very European. For example, mine, okay, we agree to everything, and afterwards we take a lot of time to implement it. So I'm certainly not criticizing Great Britain as such. But take the Lisbon Treaty, that's a very good example. There, Great Britain has asked for a general opt-out on the third pillar. That has to see with migrants, with legal assistance, everything that you would say, let's say the internal affairs of the European Union. You have been asking for a general opt-out and you got it, you know. And then you were asking yourself, now we should opt in on something, no? And then you came to the conclusion that the only solution was to opt in on everything because you couldn't select in this, you know, that this was like a chain, no? And that's the problem with the European Union. It's not whether I would be against or for a looser union, but I have never got any very serious proposal on that. There have been several prime ministers and heads of state that put it forward. For example, Rutte. Mark Rutte is a very good personal friend of mine. I asked him, but what are you going to do, Mark? What are we not going to do anymore? Give me an example of this. He never got an answer on that, although he has answers to everything, you know. So it's so an intricate system that you cannot unravel this. If you unravel it, you don't know where you stop, you know. And on the other hand, I think that there is not, how would I say, an agreement that we should go further. And by the way, once we say we should go further, then you have different opinions how to do it. Are we going to do it in an intergovernmental way? Or are we going to do it in a supranational way? And then, for example, you get into the whole problem of the economic monetary union. How are we going to proceed? Is it in the intergovernmental or supranationalist approach? And we could go into the details of what Mr. Macron is proposing. But fundamentally, this is about intergovernmentalism, no? Fundamentally, that's what it is about. So it's very, very difficult to go further, and I think it's almost impossible to backtrack.
Would you still describe the monetary union as a good idea?
That's a historical question. I mean, is it a good or a bad idea? First of all, where does it come from? It comes from the unification of Germany. It was at the moment of the reunification that in the end France, François Mitterrand gave his agreement for the unification, provided that there would be a single currency in the European Union, and that has become the euro. And then the Germans said, yes, but we will do it, but only on the proviso that it's a German monetary union. And
sure.
That's the historical agreement that led to the reunification of Germany. Are there problems in the monetary union? Yes, there are, because you have two approaches to get to a monetary union. Either you say, we simply do it, and then we will see what happens, and if we have a problem, we will fix it. That's the way we did it. It was a political decision to go for it. Huh? Just as the unification was a political decision to go for it, and to have the equality between the Ostmark and the Deutschmark was also a political decision. That's the first way to do it. The second way is what they call the Krönings theory, that you get everything in place, and then finally you coronate it by a monetary union. That, I think, economically, it makes more sense. But it never happens in practice, because unless you take a political decision, you never get to a monetary union. So let's not try to rewrite history, let's try to fix the future.
Let's fix it. Indeed, comment from the audience, please go ahead.
But there was another question by the first gentleman, if you allow me, who said, where are the boundaries of Europe? That was your question, huh?
No, my point is, what's the point of enlarging if you don't define yourself what you subscribe to? It's not just a set of...
Just two phrases on that. First of all, I believe that the enlargement is about the biggest success of the European Union. And by the way, it was instigated by Great Britain, much more than by anybody else. That's a fact of life. Why? Because it's the first time ever that we made a Pax Europea without wars. We did it on the basis of agreements. That's my first answer. Second answer is, where does Europe stop? It stops where their values are not respected anymore. So it's a community of values, and there are no physical borders, there are borders in terms of values.
But the values are currently not respected in some existing EU countries, so where's the consequence?
They are challenged. That's the difference. You see, for example, in Hungary, and you also see it in Poland, that they are challenged. But they have to backtrack when the European Commission takes action. And I'm sure that if the European Commission gets to the European Court of Justice, and sooner or later it will happen, that the European Court of Justice will decide in the favor of the European Union. It's not respecting something that's a fact. You know? Whether the result of that fact is that you can get rid of the values, that's something else. So they are challenged, but they are not, they cannot go the other way without getting into a frontal confrontation with the European Union. It's quite different.
Or, and let's be more frank, without losing money. I think this
okay,
is...
but that's a fact of life. Huh?
Right, but this is how you hurt them.
Okay, but that has always been like that in politics. I mean, you will see with the next 5-year budget of the European Union, you will see that there will be pressure from, let's say, the center of the European Union to tell to the Hungarians, you know, I mean, if you really want to get less money, then you should continue the way you are doing. And probably the discourse to Poland will be exactly the same, you know. That's politics, you know. You cannot have a democracy at that level with 28 participants and not having clashes and not having resolution methods to cope them.
Gentlemen, thank you for being patient. The floor is yours.
No problem. My name is Joe Kishishian at the King Faisal Center in Riyadh. I have two small questions. One has to do with the fact that in his famous book, The End of History, Francis Fukuyama essentially told us that nationalism will eventually wither away, and we will all become one nation down the line, even if it might take several centuries for it to occur. And of course, Europe is struggling with its nationalist questions. Now, none of you panelists have addressed really the $25,000 question in terms of European nationalism, which is the second part of my point, that what is the real challenge behind populism in Europe? It's lack of integration of an increasingly large Muslim population that has a role to play, and it will continue to grow in the European setting. Europe, at the end of 1950, used to have 22, 23% of the population of the world. Today, it's less than 10%. Of course, this is also the case in other Western countries. So therefore, what are the challenges to integrate this new wave of Europeans, and they are Europeans, because they are now part of the nationalist agenda? And is this not the reason why we have real challenges at the popular level? That not just voting economic issues, not just saying that my paycheck is not growing as fast, but also because there are real cultural challenges. I'd like to get any one of the four panelists to address that question. Thank you.
All right, thank you. We'll get to that. Do we have more questions, comments? This side is awfully quiet. You're still awake, though, right? That's good. They're paying close attention. I'm glad to hear that. Indeed, a very important point, of course, one that came in the context of what we call the migration or refugee crisis. You addressed all four. I want to start with Philip Stevens and then Ambassador. You're next. Go ahead, please.
Of course, if you look at the UK, the migration vote that we, the anti-migration vote that we saw in the Brexit was not against Muslims. It was against Poles and Slovakians and Lithuanians and things. It had nothing to do with Muslims. The Brexiteers were saying that you've got too many other Europeans coming in. So I think one has to be careful about identifying one group of people and saying these are the problems. If you look at, I think different governments in Europe have different problems. I think if you have, as Germany has now got, nearly 1 million people from a different culture arriving all together, that's going to provide some challenges. I think in the UK, if you just look at, my Muslim friends hate the description, the Muslim community, because there are lots of different Muslims. There are Shia Muslims, Sunni Muslims, there are more theological and less theological. If you look at just in the UK, you can see some of those communities are extremely well integrated and are just identifiably British and nothing else. And others live in ghettos. And that's to do not with religion, but to the social circumstances. So typically, Muslims who move into London, a very cosmopolitan city, become absorbed very quickly. Those who were put in some of the sort of what I would regard as ghettos in the north of England, where we used to have a spinning industry, textile industry, have been sort of left behind, left stranded. So I think all immigration, I'm for a liberal immigration policy. I think immigrants, certainly as far as Britain is concerned, enrich not just our economy, but our culture. And I regard Britain as a country largely of immigrants. But I think if you have large numbers from completely different cultures in short periods of time, it does create shocks. And what you have to do then is to make sure the communities to which those immigrants go are sufficiently prepared and financed, frankly. One of the problems, the mistakes the British government made was not to provide additional finance for communities where lots of Poles or lots of Slovakians all arrived at the same time.
So the situation in the UK, your point is very well taken. It might differ a bit, but the point that Mr. Kejijian was making, I think, is a fair one, Ambassador, particularly in countries like Germany, Austria, Switzerland, certainly Hungary and Poland, where indeed there is a backlash, or even in some countries refusal to take in migrants from Muslim countries. Ambassador, want to take that point?
Well, I think the part of the answer is that we have to go back what I mentioned already earlier. We have to argue more on the basis also of culture. There is a European culture. There are European values, and they don't make a distinction according to people from where their origin is, what their religion is, and I think this is an element which we have forgotten a little bit in the discussion. So this European culture soft power element is important. I think it's also important to say yes to patriotism, which is completely different from nationalism, because as somebody was saying, people want to be at home, but there is no contradiction to be at home and to be a global citizen. We should not construct this difference. And we should not construct in our national policies what happens in many of the member states, that it's us and European integration. Who the hell is the EU? We are the EU, so we have to get back, away from this separation. And I think we had this good culture. Luckily, I don't remember, I was too young, 56, Hungary. A few 100,000 Hungarians came into Austria at a moment in the 50s when Austria was a comparatively poor country, and it was no problem to accept refugees for some time, and then they were distributed further. They moved on to Germany and other countries. The reaction at the time was, we have to help them. I do remember 1968, when the same problem, a similar problem arose in Czechoslovakia. We had refugees, and they were taken care of. When Yugoslavia was breaking off, we also had refugees. It was, again, accepted, but it slowly decreasing the readiness, because it was numbers, and I think it was, at least at the beginning, not so much an issue of religion, because that's perhaps also part of the culture, if we go back to European culture, or Middle European cultures. They have always been Muslims. They have always been part of the society. That also applies to Spain. If you go to Cordoba, this is Muslim influence. So Europe and Muslims have always been together. Now Islamization, that's again something different, but I think there we are doing a big mistake if we are mixing everything together. We should have to keep these things apart. But my answer would be more European culture, more work on the soft elements from the very beginning, from the education point of view, and of course, very important, those politicians who don't want to be part of the populist, they have to cut out certain languages.
Professor Joon Kim, from an outsider perspective, this migration issue, refugee issue, which of course has caused a great deal of stir in Europe in the past couple of years. Yes. How do you assess that? How do you evaluate how Europe has handled it, how the continent has been treating this particular issue?
I understand the fear felt by most Europeans to refugee or immigration issues. But sometimes it looks very strange. Why, the most advanced and most civilized Europeans act that way to deal with the refugees, and immigrants from Middle East and Eastern Europe. So I'm not an insider of inside Europeans, but that's how I feel. That is very strange. Yeah.
So it's hard for you to understand and grasp
that's right.
the reaction, in particular on the part of the nations who refuse to take in refugees?
Yes.
That's what puzzles you? Karel de Gucht, of course, in your country also, you know, in Belgium, the Muslim integration that Mr. Kechichian has alluded to plays a big role. This issue is important, of course, because it does feed into the populist sentiment. It does feed into, we're losing our country, we're losing our culture, we're losing our faith. How do you counter that sentiment?
Well, first of all, there is a serious problem about this, and you can have two reactions. Either you can say, look, we are going to oppose and isolate the parties that try to flourish, grow on the back of this migration problem. And that's what we have been doing for about 2 decades in Europe, in Belgium, blocking the extreme right party, Vlaams Blok, to participate, let's say, in the political system. No? I have always been very much in favor of that approach. And I was at the origin, being a party president at that moment in time, to have that approach, multi-partisan, by the way. I still believe that was the best approach, and it's one of the reasons that we have been able to stem, let's say, the influence of the extreme right parties. Now, there have been other approaches, for example, in the Netherlands, that at a certain moment in time decided to have them in the government. The Wilders party has been in government for some time, and in fact, they demonstrated that they were not in a position to manage a country, and as a result of that, they lost the first elections after that experiment. Now they are coming back. So it's very difficult how to have to react to that. I believe that now the starting point should be that we unite those that go against this racist approach of migration. It is not only criticizing those that promulgate this, it's also about uniting the forces that want to stick to the fundamental values of the European Charter and to the Geneva Conventions. And you need to have the courage to step forward and say, look, that's what we should and will do. And we will have to invest much more, not in the assimilation, but in the integration of people. And there, of course, you have the difference between whether they come from, let's say, our traditional historic continent, or whether they come from not only another continent, but also another religion. That's quite different. I mean, let's be clear about that. But you have to go for it, you know. Politics is about going for goals and for projects, you know. And it's only when you do that that you have a chance to conquer at least a part of the public audience.
Certainly a challenge ahead for many of the European countries. What lies ahead for us is another 15 minutes before we wrap up this session. One last look into the audience. We have a gentleman here on the right. Microphone is coming to you. And all the way in the back then. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. My name is Yamaguchi from Japan. And I think I stand with Professor Kim and watching European history as a sort of model of human development. In that sense, my question may be a little bit different from the previous discussion. But I thought that when the European Union was integrating and expanding eastward, this is the end of the sort of history. Since the 17th century, starting with the 30 Years' War, Europeans kept fighting wars for 300 years. And I thought that the Europeans tired of fighting war against each other. And at that time, Europe was a world. Asian people used to look at Europe as a model of world. So I thought at the end of the Cold War and the European Union expansion is a sort of end of the history or the new era. Particularly, this is a completion of postmodern world, but it was not. Not mentioning about the Brexit, but I was so disappointed by Russian Crimea and the Ukraine thing. European looked like getting back into the modern or even pre-modern world. My question is to European representative is that are you optimistic enough to look at this current development as a sort of ups and downs, and we are going to this way, or we are returning to modern dynamism?
All right, thank you so much, which will serve, your comment very well taken, it will serve as a great final question for all four panelists to look ahead. Go ahead, gentlemen.
I'm the ambassador of Romania, and as it seems that I am the only ambassador from a EU member state who is present here, I thought I should also maybe make 1 or 2 points. First of all, I'm a EU enthusiast, and if I may be proud of something that I did during my diplomatic career, it definitely is the success we had joining the European Union. It was definitely one of our most important objectives of foreign policy. Now, 12 years later, as I said, I'm still EU enthusiast, because it's obvious for me that it is a tremendous success story and an obvious win-win situation. Everybody before me said about EU being the project that managed to ensure peace in Europe. I don't know if anybody pointed out the huge economic advantages, but I also want to point out the cultural advantages, the cultural exchanges, and as a person who, before becoming a diplomat, taught at the university in Bucharest, I was very glad to see that all my students could go to different universities in Europe freely to complete their studies or to receive a PhD there.
Right.
But coming back to populism, which is the topic of this panel, my opinion is that definitely not the European Union is to blame for the rise of populism. I think that this is rather a pretext used by populist politicians for, not trying to cover the internal problems that they are not able to solve. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the input from the Romanian ambassador. Very important one, of course. And for the remainder now, we'll do a final round, picking up on what the gentleman from Japan said, which I want to pass on to you, Philip Stevens. Why don't we start in reverse order then this time and end the panel with Karel de Gucht. Namely, the very important question. We have enjoyed an unprecedented streak of peace in the European continent, 75 years now, hopefully much longer to come. So do you see the problems, the challenges that we have been talking about in the previous 90 minutes here, populism? Is this just a bump in the roads in what is going to be another bright future for EU, or do you really think all the challenges, the combination of all the challenges that we're facing right now, could be a turning point for this union?
Okay. First, can I just say in response to the Romanian ambassador that I actually absolutely agree with him that the populists made the EU a scapegoat, a lightning rod, as it were, for lots of other things. And that's, as I said, what happened in the Brexit debate. I think the question that our Japanese colleague makes is one that should worry everyone who is pro-European, because the nightmare is will historians look back on this period as an interlude? We've had, we had the pre-modern, modern, and then post-modern worlds, and then we went back to the modern 19th century world. And I think the reason it should be a nightmare is because if you look at after the end of the Second World War, the case for Europe almost made itself, the case for European integration. We'd been slaughtering each other for nearly 50 years. A break with that tradition was very powerful. We had in the United States the superpower that was prepared to underwrite that break, as it were, with the past. So peace and prosperity were very powerful standards under which all Europeans could march. I think at the end of the Cold War, the reason for Europe was still there because it was Europe whole and free. Look, we have to extend this area of peace and prosperity to our neighbors. The Cold War had been as well part of the cement which bound Europe together. We had a common adversary. If you talk to the present generation of Europeans, their memories of the Second World War have are generally quite slight. They don't. A lot of them, were born or were terribly young when the Berlin Wall came down. So I think we're now in a position where we have to keep making the case for European integration. And it is a very strong case. It's the case that together we individually prosper and are more secure than we would apart. And it's obvious. And I think Walter Russell Mead in the opening session this morning made the very powerful case that American politicians hadn't, with their own electorates, pointed out the benefits that accrued to the United States from its leadership of the liberal order. And this was a real weakness. I think this is a weakness we as Europeans now have. But I think that whereas 20 years ago I sort of assumed that Europe was forever, I don't think we can make that assumption anymore. We have to work at Europe and explain Europe, but also, as I said, not just change the rhetoric, change the national as well as European policies so people can see visibly that they're better off, more prosperous and more secure together rather than separated.
We need to explain Europe, Ambassador. This is what you do on a daily basis. This is why also with the remaining 5-6 minutes that we have left to wrap up this panel, is this a bump in the road that we're just experiencing? Are you hopeful? Are you optimistic when it comes to the future of the EU?
Yes, I think I am optimistic. I think it's a little bit like if you look on the development of the markets, if it's going this way, but if you look with a magnifying glass, you see it might be like this. And sometimes if you are down, you don't see that the trend actually is up.
So if the EU was a stock, you would invest in it now?
I would still invest, but I think it needs leadership, and it needs probably more and probably better leadership.
Who's going to provide this leadership?
And I think this leadership we will only get when the member states do their homework first, because you cannot impose something on a union, and we are not the United States of Europe. We are the European Union. So we need the buy-in of the member states and they have more responsibility than they seem to be aware of. And I think this is one of the essential elements which we need in order to have a good future. And the second element is very close to my heart, is never ever take peace for granted. I think this is a big mistake. I have seen from Austria in '92 tanks in Slovenia and burning houses in Slovenia. That's not long history. I have seen it, and '92 is not that long. And that was one of the downs, and therefore we have worked on enlargement. So never ever take that for granted, and that is something I think which is getting even more traction now in the European Union, because any poll you look at, European citizens are in favor of more European foreign policy as a peace policy, which, as I have read out before, is defined even in the Constitution, in the article of the European Union. I think there we get our citizens, and there we have to deliver, but we can only deliver if all the member states take it to their responsibility, and then this Brussels, which doesn't exist, can take the responsibility.
Let's not take this long streak of peace on the continent for granted. A very passionate plea on the part of the ambassador, Joon Kim. As somebody who clearly has a great deal of passion and interest in the EU, what do you foresee for this union?
I'm also EU enthusiast. And all I want to say is that you have enough. Why desire more, causing all kinds of problems? There is so-called the bicycle theory of integration, according to which halting of evolution would cause the opposite cause, the disintegration of European integration. But I don't think this theory stands on a solid ground. And one more thing I want to say. It seems to me European people now want to know what kind of future they await them. And European politicians sought to portray themselves as a kind of professional manager, seeking a third way and de-emphasizing the ideological differences between political parties. So they cannot provide an answer to that kind of question. So I think if there is a European crisis, it is a crisis of political vision. Mm-hmm. Okay. That's what I have to say.
It's a crisis of a political vision, says Joon Kim, which of course would suggest and desire new political leadership in order to overcome that. Karel de Gucht, we started this very engaging and informative panel with you. We're going to end it with you. Final remarks as far as the future of the EU is concerned.
First remark I would like to make is that human memory is always very short, you know. Philip Stevens talked about war, but take, for example, the monetary union. Everybody, I remember very well, was enthusiastic about the fact that they now could travel without using all the time different currencies, going to Italy with the lira, you never know what it really worth, etc., etc. So people were very thrilled about this, and now you have a lot of criticism of the monetary union. So human memory is very short, which means that this union needs a new message to the millennials, no? That's what we really need. And there are a number of problems we have to fix. I believe it's the banking union. But then you have to translate the banking union into, how would I say, arguments that touch the human soul, you know? I mean, because this is a very technical problem, but for example, if we could put into place a system whereby deposits are guaranteed at the European level, that would be tangible, you know? So you need tangible proposals to be made. Secondly, about migration, this is a very difficult problem. It's not only in Europe, it's everywhere, by the way. And we have to fix it at the European level. And there will need to be a certain pressure on member states to play ball with respect to this, because if not, you are not going to make it in the other countries either. And that's about political leadership. So it's true that you need political leadership. And I think one of the most promising facts of the recent history is that you see that there are again politicians that believe that European politics can be politically interesting. So we come out of an era that everybody thought, I mean, if you talk about Europe, you better don't do that if you want to get some votes, you know. Now you have, again, a class of politicians, a generation of politicians, by the way, that are all in their 40s. They are rather young, you know. Take Macron, take Rutte, take our own Prime Minister in Belgium, Luxembourg. All these people are in their 40s, and they realize that well, you could make a career on the basis of Europe, and that's what you need. And if you really need a political elite, you have to convince that elite that taking the lead in Europe could be very rewarding.
Rewarding indeed. This panel has been very rewarding. I think I speak for all here in the audience when I say that in the amount that was given to us, we were able to extract many important points. Populism in Europe, I'm afraid it's a topic that's going to be with us for a while. Certainly the trend suggests this is not a declining, but rather a rising tendency within Europe. We will keep a very close eye on it. Thank you for your attention, and let's end this great discussion with a big round of applause for this great panel. Thank you. Thank you.
This concludes our morning session, and we will now proceed to our lunch break and book launch. Lunch will be provided in the foyer right outside this room. At 12:30, we will invite Dr. Michael Green to Grand Ballroom 1 to celebrate the launch of his book, By More Than Providence. We hope that you can all join us. Thank you.